Good afternoon, evening, everybody, and welcome to the session of this evening titled Markets as Mediators, Food and Cooking Outside the World of Cookbooks. The first presentation will be presented by myself, followed by Q&A, and then followed by the second presentation by my colleague Ryan Whibbs. First, I would like to just briefly introduce our session and then introduce our moderator, Julia, followed by the first presentation. So this session is titled Markets as Mediators, Food and Cooking Outside the World of Cookbooks, and it focuses on the intersection between textual recipes, textual recipe traditions, and evidence left behind from the market life of late medieval and early modern European food habits. While texts offer insight into ideal approaches to producing food, there is enough evidence left behind by butchers, merchants of fruits and vegetables, cooks and caterers to give us a slightly different glimpse into the daily life of food habits that existed parallel to recipe collections, which were often produced in the aristocratic traditions. So today we'll speak about something different, still related to cookbooks and cooking. But first, I would like to introduce Julia, our moderator, who will briefly lay out the rules of this session and how the Q&A will function. Julia?
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to remind everyone, you already know the procedure. You have the Q&A button down below, and I would just ask you, as soon as you can think of any questions you might have for the presenters, that you already type them in so that we can get to the questions right after the presentation and don't have to wait. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will start my presentation. For those who, have different things to do after some time, the session is recorded and will be uploaded via YouTube tomorrow. So if for some reason you cannot finish this session, no worries, you can always watch it back later in your own time. And this goes for all sessions of the CoReMA conference. So I will share my screen. Yes. So my presentation is titled Neemt groene cryuden, in Dutch, Take Green Herbs, an archaeobotanical perspective on vegetal ingredients bought, prepared, and consumed in the city of Delft between 1600 and 1800. This might be a bit different than you have than the previous presentations, because I'm an archaeobotanist and not an historian yet. So I would like to bring you into the world of archaeobotany and inform you about research that I do, which does include cookbook analysis, to give you an idea of what the culinary tradition in cookbooks can tell you if you are not an historian. Let me just check. Yes. So what's for dinner? When you Google this, it's a question that is asked almost every day, but it differs where you are, the time of year, if you have time on your hands or what you want to eat. So if you Google it, there is a lot of information, often bundled in a book that gives you easy recipes or quick dishes, or sometimes even very elaborate recipes to cook something. But the question I often ask myself is, how often do we really cook from a cookbook? Most meals that we prepare on a daily basis are something that we do not need a recipe for, that we know by heart, by practicing, by doing week after week, or maybe not that often, but still it's in the tip of our fingers. So food is the most important consumer product. It's everywhere. It's on our daily mind, but it's not something that we give credit to, in my opinion, because providing and consuming food regulates the daily life of people. It has done in the past and it still does. So nowadays it's a bit easier to just go to the supermarket to procure your ingredients for your daily meal. So the question I ask myself is, what did people eat in the past and how did this change through time? So I study food consumption practices from an archaeobotanical and an historical point of view. And first I will give you a bit of background into archaeobotany, as I assume most of you are, well, not archaeologists or not that well versed in archaeobotany. So I've made a sort of overview of my research, and I will focus on the ingredients taken from an archaeobotanical perspective and a culinary historical perspective. And all this ties together. I'm halfway through my PhD project. So within 2 years, I hope to present a very nice overview of food consumption practices in early modern Delft from the 1600s to the 1800s from an archaeological and a historical point of view. So when you look at past food consumption practices, there's the archaeological sources, archaeobotanical material, zoological material, and culinary material culture, and historical sources, which include culinary texts, purchase orders, eco-documents, and many more. And I will focus this presentation within the archaeobotanical material and the culinary texts. So archaeological sources include archaeobotany, which is the study of plant remains from archaeological excavations. A fascinating field, if you ask me. It studies the human-plant relationships in the past, and I mean the deep past until practically yesterday. How do people interact with the environment? And this also goes for zooarchaeology or archaeozoology, which is the study of animal remains from archaeological excavations. And again, the human-animal relationship in the past and how this changed. Then there is also the culinary material culture, the study of material culture in a broad sense from archaeological excavations. And well, of course, you can rarely think about food practices or food preparation without some form of material culture. So these three types of archaeology and archaeological research are very interwoven, though within this presentation, I will focus on the archaeobotanical research. So if you want to know what people ate in the past, it's important to not only look at a cookbook, but for instance, also look at waste that people produce, because everything we do produces waste. And the waste that we study as archaeologists can tell us a lot about daily habits from past people. So if you want to know what people ate, you do not only look at their, let's say, kitchen waste, but also at their consumption waste, which is deposited in cesspits, at least for urban centers in the Low Countries from the 1500 onwards. And a cesspit, I think most of you know what's inside a cesspit. It includes human excrement as a primary filling. That's its primary purpose. And secondary filling includes kitchen refuse, domestic refuse, which is used, especially the domestic refuse, to use for dating the archaeological context. And by dating, by looking at the shards of pottery or glassware or pipes, we can determine the age of a cess layer, and within that layer, all archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological finds will be about the same age. So for you who have never seen a cesspit sample, this is what it looks like. Cesspits can contain thousands of liters of cess, even though they were cleaned regularly. Even though they were cleaned regularly, they still contain a lot of material. from different layers, from different ages. And it's always stored wet because that helps the conservation of the plant remains. When you sieve it, because you want to get rid of all the cess and only look at the animal remains, the plant remains, or the material culture, then you get different fractions of cess, which provide you a first glimpse of what's inside. So probably you have no idea what you're looking at, and that's why we use a microscope. So if you look through the microscope, this is what you see: large seeds and smaller ones. To the left, you will see different prunes, so that's cherry and plum, also a bit of shell from a hazelnut, and well, there is, but it's not very visible, but I know because I looked at it. There's also some, forgot the English word, mespilus. Doesn't matter. And on the right, you'll see through the microscope a bit of text. So there's always a bit of history present. This is from a catalog because the cesspit belonged to a printer. So this was just a very small fragment of text that was found in that cesspit. And there's also to the right, you will see a sort of a yellow chaff fragment, which is rice, a very nice and interesting find. And I was just informed that indeed medlar is the correct English name for mespilus. Thank you. So looking through the microscope, you can see many different seeds and fruits and plant remains, which will then be analyzed, identified, and listed by looking at different, seed atlases, or as you can see on the left down side, there's some examples of what a page looks like. And on the right, you can see the reference collection that we have at the Groningen Institute of Archaeology, which is a very nice and elaborate reference collection from seeds and fruits from all over the world, because, well, of course, food traveled, especially during the early modern time, and food came from everywhere. So we need to have a proper reference collection to make a species list, which looks like this. This is just a blurb from one of the species lists from different cesspits, and it's just, well, to the left, it's the scientific name of the plant part, preservation mode, and if it's fragmented or whole, which is very important because, well, if you look at a an ingredient, a food item, very rarely it's not prepared one way or another. So by assessing if the seed or fruit or plant part is fragmented or whole, if it shows any signs of preparation marks, such as cutting or chewing or pressing, fragmenting in any way, that's always registered to be sure that you can actually, well, say something about the plant use. So looking at different eras of cesspit use in the Netherlands, you can see that there are, well, quite a lot of plant species that were used. These are only the ones present in over 50% of cesspits in urban areas, because regularly we find about 60 to 70 edible plant species. And this is just the species that are almost always present. And you can see on the top is fig, which is almost always present in large numbers. But numbers do not say that much, because many of you who've eaten a fig know that there are hundreds of seeds in a fig, up to 2,000 even. So finding one fig seed does not say as much as finding one cherry stone, as each cherry just contains one stone. So within archaeology, archaeobotany, it's very difficult to say something about the amount of fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices, nuts, cereals that were consumed in the past, but it is an excellent field of research if you want to know which social classes ate certain food items more or less during a certain time period in a certain region. As archaeology often does not really discriminate because everybody leaves waste behind, just depending on how full the cesspit is. So I promised you also some culinary texts. So I define culinary texts as a collection of documents or singular documents that discuss food preparation practices and food consumption practices in a pretty broad sense. But I focus on cookbooks because I have the assumption that if you want to know what was available, more or less, you should actually also look at cookbooks because they do list a lot of ingredients, and it's up to me to study, verify if they were used or not in a certain way. So I do not look at medical treatises, etiquette books, herbaria, though herbaria are very useful for me as an archaeobotanist to assess if wild plant, as an archaeobotanist would say, was also used for either medicinal or culinary purposes. So what do cookbooks show? Of course, ingredients in general, but for my interest, it's floral ingredients. And I've categorized them as cereals, fruits, vegetables, nuts, herbs, and spices, with, of course, some, generalizations, because certain items could be used as either a herb or a spice or condiment. So it's arbitrary, but I'm looking into that. There are also, of course, faunal ingredients. People were vegetarians in the past, but not necessarily. So meat, mammal, fish, fowl are also present in the cookbooks. And I do look at them, just not from an archaeobotanical point of view, as well as animal byproducts, such as butter, cheese, and eggs, which are present sometimes. Well, eggs are present in cesspits sometimes. So I do check if they are from chicken or geese or another bird. Still, there are also drinks listed in cookbooks, like buttermilk or beer as ingredients. Of course, you add wine, perhaps how to make a lemonade. And very interesting, different types of water for cooking are listed, but it's never stated that it is used for drinking. The reason I look at the cookbooks is because I'm very interested in the preparation methods. Because as I've said that as an archaeobotanist, I do find a lot of food ingredients, like the fruits, the vegetable parts, sometimes the plant remains, such as a leaf or a piece of fruit. This does not say anything about how the food was prepared, but cookbooks do. So they do give me a lot of information about the reason that I might not find certain ingredients, but more on that later. So I've studied a selection of cookbooks from the Netherlands, printed cookbooks, because I have the idea that for getting a sort of insight into what people ate in the past in general on a more daily basis, I really need to look at printed cookbooks because they were distributed widely and could have been used by many people, especially later on in the, let's say, 18th century, especially in the 19th century, that more and more people in the Netherlands could own a cookbook. And they were also written for the more frugal housewife or the housemaid that could cook daily meals. So also the information from these cookbooks I am writing down in an Excel sheet. This is again a blurb from a cookbook analysis that I practice. So per recipe, I list all the ingredients in English and Dutch, include remarks, for instance, if it's young or local or fresh or in season, numbers that are mentioned, like amounts. The preparation type is what I really focus on. How is an item prepared? And will that give me an idea if it's absent from my cesspits for that reason or just because it wasn't eaten that often. Also, I add the cooking type, the cooking time, material culture, because I'm still an archaeologist. I'm very interested in the diversity of items used in a kitchen. But then again, of course, some of these items are, let's say, restricted to the upper classes of society, as not everyone owned a silver plate to serve a meal. So this is still work in progress, but I hope to get some feedback in the discussion. So more cookbooks are scrutinized as we speak, with a number of an overview of floral ingredients mentioned in cookbooks. And you can see that there, well, especially between 1700 and 1800, a lot of herbs are mentioned. The amount of cereals mentioned in cookbooks is not so high. That's because it is often referred to as flour or bread even, not specified which cereal was used. So this is very interesting for me because as an archaeobotanist, I do find the cereals that were actually used. I do find the herbs that were used when someone in a cookbook mentions that you use green herbs or seasonal herbs or seasonal vegetables. That can mean a myriad of things which are not specified because the user, the reader, could just choose whatever was available. So it will be very interesting to see how the ingredients mentioned in cookbooks relate to what I find as an archaeobotanist. So mostly mentioned in the cookbooks that I've studied now as cereals are wheat, rice, and rye, even though as an archaeobotanist, I do mostly find, well, still wheat and rye, but mostly find millets and buckwheat, which is something that I'm still looking into because they are not often mentioned in cookbooks, but are often found in the cesspits. So fruits, citrus, either orange or lime, and even lemon is often mentioned in cookbooks, but rarely found as in cesspits, which is very interesting. Apple, raisin, and cherry. Within the type of raisin, we're not sure because we do find grape pips, but it's not sure if they are table grapes or raisins or currants. They are often found too. So vegetables, artichoke, leek, and onion are very rarely found because of the plant parts that are used. Lettuce, also the leaves are used, but we do find a number of seeds which are probably harvested together with the vegetable lettuce to, well, and then just cleaned and thrown out. So that would be kitchen waste. Herbs are parsley, thyme, marjoram, and chervil. We do find the fruits of these herbs, very rarely the leaves, though rosemary is sometimes found because the leaves are pretty sturdy. Spices is a very different story. We only find pepper, ginger, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, and nutmeg have not yet been found, though cloves are found as pollen. So we do know cloves were transported and consumed. We have only never found the actual clove fragments. And nuts mentioned in cookbooks are almond, walnut, and chestnut, which we do often find in cesspits, but because the shells preserve really, really well. And of course, they are unedible. So unless they were thrown in the fire or grounded up for one or another reason, they preserve well and are found quite often. So it's also interesting to get an idea, grasp of where the food comes from within urban regions, because of course a city is never self-supportive, not completely at least. So urban centers, they do need to import foodstuffs from other regions and even abroad. So this is Thunen's model, which I find very nice as a visual clue how that is distributed. So local origins, are fruits, herbs, and vegetables. They are, grown in gardens just outside city center, city walls. They can be grown inside the city if the person owning a small plot of land or a small garden, he or she grows something for the household. More regional is also still fruit, herbs, vegetables, and cereals, which is in, let's say the second ring. And more international still, fruit, herbs, vegetables, cereals, nuts, and spices. They were imported from abroad, and global origin are cereals and spices. And we know this from an archaeobotanical point of view, because we know which plants grow in which climates, which soil type they prefer, and especially by looking at the weeds that are present in our cesspits, or other contexts within the city that show us, a type of weed that was present in a certain agricultural field. For instance, Schoenoplectus mucronatus, which is ribbelbies. It is a weed of Mediterranean rice fields. So even though we do not always find rice, when we find the weed, we know it was present, but perhaps properly cleaned and consumed, properly digested or thrown out elsewhere. And we also make the difference between archaeophytes and neophytes, which means that archaeophytes were introduced prior to 1500 and neophytes were introduced after. So most food items that were exchanged via the post-Columbian exchange, they are neophytes, but what the Romans introduced in the Netherlands or elsewhere, or earlier on, they are called archaeophytes. Within history of historical research, I look at purchase orders and city ordinances to see where food came from. Shipping and toll inventories also help, but the recipe description is often also very informative, stating that it should be such and such cheese, for instance, or butter. So butter from Ireland was often claimed to be pretty good, but also Dutch butter of the highest quality was used in certain recipes. So this helps me get a better overview of where the food items came from and how they were prepared when looking at recipes and how they are present or absent in cesspits. So within a book in 1952, it was very nicely portrayed how food items were transported. It's in Dutch, so I will translate. So the first is the trade in fruits in the Western Netherlands, so the provinces of Holland. And you can see very central is Amsterdam, which just got a lot of fruits from all over the Netherlands. And on the right, you can see the trade of vegetables. And you can see that there is, more trade going to Amsterdam, but also to other places such as Leiden or The Hague. And this map hasn't been updated since 1952, so I'm very interested to see what the research that is being done now will show me about the origin of food items. So I'll briefly discuss similarities and differences that I found within my archaeobotanical and historical research. First of all, there's a great overlap between the archaeobotanical cesspit finds and the ingredients listed in cookbooks. So very often what I find in cesspits is also mentioned in cookbooks, almost all the time. Some exceptions are, for instance, medlar, or as I mentioned, millet and buckwheat, ingredients that are very rarely listed in recipes, or at least the recipes that I've studied, but are very often present in cesspits. So the archaeobotanical research helps to infer potential spread and preference of ingredients in regions. This is getting more and more attention nowadays, that there might be regional preferences that could be discerned by looking at cesspits, and not only at cookbooks, because, well, they are not always that specific for a region, at least for, let's say, the 17th and 18th century printed cookbooks, that is. Manuscripts could be very specific for a certain region. The archaeobotanical research helps to infer a variety of plant species consumed, because I find them in the cesspit, so I know they were actually prepared in the kitchen and consumed. The recipe analysis helps to infer potential preparation of ingredients, so explaining the absence in cesspits. For instance, herbs and spices are often prepared in a certain way that is finely chopped or grounded or even pulverized in the case of many spices that are just, well, undiscernible for archaeobotanists with the techniques that we use still. Future new methodologies might shed different lights on the contents of cesspits, but we're not there yet, unfortunately. And recipe analysis helps to infer combinations of ingredients, because it's of course very important that an ingredient does not stand alone. It is often combined with other ingredients to prepare a dish. So as an archaeobotanist, I find the loose ingredients, but I do not know if they were combined in a certain way. And the analysis of recipes does shed a light on possible combinations. So a rough overview: there are on average 60 edible plant species recovered from urban cesspits. This varies. If you are looking at the seeds and fruits, or also including pollen or new techniques, such as looking at plant tissues, which can help identify leaves and stems and fruits, but is not used that often yet. Compared to the ingredients listed in cookbooks, there are over 100 edible plant species listed in those cookbooks that I've studied. And then I do not mean the 6 types of apples that might have been used for either a juice or a jam or an apple pie. So purely species specific, there were quite a few edible plant species that have been consumed in the past. And again, just to recap, so almost all plant species I found in cesspits are also mentioned in cookbooks. Still, there are some plant species absent either in the cookbook or the cesspit. And by combining this type of research, you get a better overview of what is missing, why it is missing, and if there's either a different way for archaeobotanists to address the absence, or for historians even to perhaps think that this ingredient was not that preferred in a certain region or era, perhaps. So putting this information together in a visual way is, I like this painting from Joachim Beukelaar. In red, you will see the fruits found in cesspits. In blue, you will find the vegetables found in cookbooks. And in yellow, the vegetables found in cesspits too. So there is some overlap, and still some things to look into from an archaeobotanical point of view. So the next step in this line of research is to get a better understanding of food processing and food preparation techniques, as they do tell us quite a lot, not only how food was prepared, but as I said, why archaeobotanists cannot find them or identify them. Alternative archaeobotanical methods are looking at plant tissue, aDNA and eDNA, so ancient DNA and environmental DNA, but these methods are pretty new, and in the case of aDNA and eDNA, pretty expensive, but research is ongoing, so they will provide very interesting insights in the near future. And what's also important, and that's where more historical research comes in, is the role of the cookbook author, because of course, many recipes, as you all know, were plagiarized or just slightly adapted between cookbooks. So there is the literal translation versus adaptive translation. And also to keep in mind the conservative nature of cookbooks, as many recipes have barely changed in hundreds of years. So this will all help to get an idea of the ratio of archaeobotanical remains and how that relates to ingredients in culinary recipes. Oh, excuse me. And I would like to hear your thoughts. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. Oh, excuse me. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation and this new point of view. I have already 2 questions for you. The first is by Beatrice Regnon. Good evening. Do we know the use of weed?
Do you mean the weed as in weeds in the field, or weed as in cannabis sativa?
I think this would need to be cleared up. I also have another question. Maybe Beatrice can explain. The second question is by Virginie about the free printed books. For the notable Boeken van Kokkerin, they are only 1 edition, but for the others, these are differences between all the editions. Which edition did you use and why this one? I am thinking of the difference of sometimes half a century between the editions, and therefore relatively rapid evolution at the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Golden Century.
Yes, so that's a good question. I have just, to be honest, randomly selected cookbooks, but if, for instance, there was a reprint 3 years later, I have checked quickly to see if anything changed, especially in the difference of species mentioned in the recipes, but it's not often the case. And I am still, so for the 18th century, end of the 18th century, there are more reprints or newer editions that I've not yet looked into. So it's very time consuming to just dissect all these recipes. And I'm thinking that, well, if I focus now and do a lot of work, I can make the information public, but also just keep on reusing the data to answer different questions. So the newer editions and the newer ingredients or different ingredients or cooking techniques mentioned are still something to keep in mind. I've not really gotten to that part yet, but I'm going to, yeah.
Thank you. Beatrice said it's the question medical, culture, or else. I'm not sure if she is referring to hemp or...
Well, in the case of hemp, it was used as a rope. And in the case of cannabis, it was probably used medicinally, but we also have historical information that it was used as fodder for birds. So there was a nun, or at least I think she was a nun. Well, she worked in a convent, so I assume she was a nun, who had a very pretty bird who she fed hemp seeds or cannabis seeds. And a lot of students, when they get their first introduction into archaeobotany, they do love to look at medicinal plants or poisonous plants or cannabis sativa as weed, because they are very interested in its use in the past. But that's quite difficult to see from an archaeobotanical perspective, because we know the plant was present, we know it was used. In the case of hemp, you need the fibers of the plant, so it does not matter if it's flowered and produced fruits. In the case of medicinal uses, you would need the fruits. And I do not know if they were prepared a certain way that we would see, for instance, that they were pressed for oil, for instance. We do know that for linseed, so flax, also used for its fibers, but there are flax seeds that have been pressed that have a hole in the center that were used for their oil, but we also find linseed that was fragmented, more jagged edges, that is always interpreted, most often interpreted as actual consumption of the seeds. If it's human or maybe also by animals like birds, we do not know, but they do end up in a cesspit. So human use in one way or another is most evident, yeah, most probable.
I have also two more questions. The first by Eisenteniere Apur. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I may have missed the specific time period you looked at, but did you find any evidence of New World foods such as maize or tomatoes in cesspits or recipes?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I specifically study the period between 1500 and 1800. So yeah, New World species should be present. We do have found some capsicum seeds, so bell pepper or chili pepper. We cannot tell the difference. It's the same species. So maybe in the future, aDNA can tell us which is which. But maize has not been found. Tomatoes only in the late 19th century, which is very interesting because we know they were available on a smaller scale. We also know from historical sources that they were like the potato at first not really utilized because of the family, the Solanaceae, which is poisonous. But the preservation of tomato seeds is very good because they have this, this coating, which makes them very easy to digest, but they do not, they are not really digested, if you can say that. So we should find more than we do at the moment. The thing is that if they are not preserved very well due to soil circumstances like low water levels, then it's still a Solanaceae, and they do somewhat look alike. So if the preservation is not excellent, it's very difficult to tell them apart. And it could be that, I won't say many, but some tomato seeds are identified as either physalis or maybe something else that was present in the Netherlands for a longer period of time. Yes. Okay. But also for potatoes, we have not found potato seeds yet, but I hope with the tissue research that we might find some potato peels in our cesspits that we can identify, but that's still wishful thinking.
Thank you. The next question is from Scott Stahl. Have you found any phytolith evidence of things like cinnamon? I don't know how much phytolith evidence is even preserved for cinnamon or other spices, so I don't know if it is even preserved.
That's a good question. So phytolith research is not done for the early modern time in the Netherlands because of the preservation of the seeds and fruits in general. It's very well preserved due to the high water levels, which is just a plus if you live here, so below the sea level. But for other regions, if conservation is not optimum or there are no seeds and fruits available, phytolith research is being done, but that would be more for, let's say, the Neolithic or even the Mesolithic period. I am looking into the tissue, plant tissue that is present in my cesspit samples. For instance, I have the idea that rhubarb, which was consumed in the past, they do leave phytoliths and some very specific structures in their stems. So if I would find some rhubarb tissue, I could recognize it. But for cinnamon and most other spices, no, they are not studied here. They are looked into in other regions, but not for the Netherlands. But perhaps another researcher might do so in the near future. It would be very useful because we do use pollen analysis to study the presence of spices and also vegetables, because they the leafy parts of vegetables, but also the, let's say, the bark of cinnamon or the root of ginger and the cloves, they might have left traces of pollen behind, but they are not always easily identifiable on a species level, sometimes on a genus level. But cinnamon would assume that we would find a piece of bark sometime in the near future, but unfortunately not yet. No.
Thank you. I have two more questions, and I think afterwards we will have to move on so as to not cut time. The next question is from Mariella Boykers. You mentioned raisins and grapes. Do you know what percentage of those finds are whole pips, and what percentage are pips that are worked on, so show signs of damage?
Yes, that's a really good question, Mariella. So most pips, and let's say that will be about 70% are whole, are not fragmented. But that means that either, so 30%, maybe a bit less, 20%. So this is just ballpark numbers, because I haven't counted them. There are thousands, but they are either underdeveloped. So they are too small. They are of different shades of colors. You can see the form growing, but they are underdeveloped, or they are fragmented. And that's often, so the more narrow side of the pip is then broken off. And I have not yet any clue if that is because it was chewed and people just spat it out, because that happens. But I do not know the amounts of tannin present in grape pips in the past, but presently you would still not like to chew on a grape pip. And pressing through a sieve or working it with a mortar and pestle, they have shown different results. So yes, a small percentage was worked, but I do not know how. And I also do not know what it was used for. So that's something that will be looked at in the future, near future.
Thank you. The next and last question, we also have more questions for you in the Q&A, but maybe you would like to type them out to the people who keep, just so that you can keep the dialogue. The last one we will talk about is from Yang Soon Ra. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I have two questions. Number one, if we cannot find a cesspit of the period which we want to research, what another archaeological resource can help us? Can we say we can research archaeologically the food of when we want to know? Number two, it would be wonderful if you work with the other archaeologists which work with animal, porcelain, etc. We can construct the food life of Delft quite completely. And number two means she would like to hear your opinion about
Yeah. So thank you for the question. The first, because cesspits were installed in urban centers in the Netherlands from the 14th, 15th century onwards, but only for the richer inhabitants who could own a plot of land, a garden or a basement to install a cesspit. Often other contexts, such as normal pits, were used, and even sometimes water wells that were taken out of practice were filled with cess. So archaeologists do often find, either shallow pits or pretty deep pits that contain human excrement, sometimes mixed with animal excrement, which is then covered and totally forgotten until we find it. So always look for pits and just check if they have a sort of earthy vegetable plant content. Probably that is either excrement, cess, or manure, dung, or kitchen waste that you could study. Sometimes, if you have smaller settlements or it's not wandering, but nomadic peoples, then it's a big difficulty because you have no idea if they had certain regions outside of their encampment to do their business. So that's just, you'd have to be lucky to find pits that contain excrement. So it's something to keep in mind, but archaeologists often do find some traces of waste left behind, either just excrement or combined with kitchen waste, for instance. And regarding the possibility to work together with zooarchaeologists and material culture specialists, we are doing that. For my PhD research, I'm just an archaeobotanist trying to figure out what people ate and how that changed. But there's a side project that I'm working on where we have a cesspit from an orphanage in Delft, which was used for 75 years, the content of that cesspit. The orphanage just, I think, was 500 years in use. But we have a window of opportunity to study 75 years of food consumption practices. There is a zoologist looking at the animal bones and the fish remains. There is a parasite specialist looking at parasites and other bacteria and diseases that might still be present in the cess. There's also a palynologist looking at the pollen to see if even more plant species can be found. And we have a historian who will, together with me, study the purchase orders from the orphanage to see what was purchased, how much was purchased, and how many children were living in those 75 years, to see the amount of food that they ate and if that corresponds with what we find in the cesspit. So it's, yeah, we're starting this summer when the archives are open again in the Netherlands. And within the Netherlands, you have commercial archaeology where within excavations, those specialists all work together to produce a report. Though, let's say, food consumption practices are only just one chapter in that report. So there's still some work to be done, but it is, it's being part of the research that is being done.
Thank you. Yeah, we have one question left. Maybe you could answer it directly in the Q&A so we can.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
I will do that. But first, I would like to introduce my colleague, Ryan, who is giving the second presentation. Ryan is joining us from Canada, still the whole day ahead. And he will talk about gens experts and non-suspects, talking about, let's say the caterers and cooks, more from an historical point of view, I think. So Ryan, please give your presentation.
Thank you very much, Merit, for your introduction and amazing and fascinating paper. I have to apologize, but I'll also be pestering you with questions after this session because it was really fascinating. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. As Merit mentioned, our panel, and I will just share my screen here. Let me see, this is the right screen. So it should be shared right now. This session drops us down into the late medieval and very early modern marketplace. And it encourages us to think about food in its public habitat, in places where communities came together to buy ingredients. And in these contexts, people normally did not bring their cookbooks or their recipe manuals. In the market, they really had their shopping basket and possibly a shopping list, some of which survived from this period. The market then sits one or more steps away from the textuality of cookbooks. And in Paris, at least, between 1475 and 1599, it places us into a landscape of butchers, of bakers, candlestick makers, and others who patronize the cookshops of Paris. And I'm just going to change my slide here. There we go. In this paper, I will examine the rules and regulations that governed apprenticeships in Paris's cookshops focusing particularly on the recipe for making a good chef. What ingredients did the Paris masters expect of apprentices and journey persons? What elements of training did masters expect guilds persons to be competent at? Who could run a cookshop in Paris during this time? What do these guild sources say about cookery books of the time? The sources I will use today come from 3 guilds that were active between 1475 to 1599, and each of which received royal grants of charters for their guild during this time. The 3 guilds that I'm looking at today are the Roti Sewers, the Charcutiers, and the Culinaires. Each of these guilds operated independently of each other in the city and the suburbs of Paris. And these guilds knew each other well, since they often sued each other and appealed cases against each other within Paris's guild court, the Grand Châtelet. The Roti Sewers were the oldest of these 3 guilds, and they were granted their first charter in 1258. They ran the public cookshops within the old city and the suburbs of Paris, and were allowed to sell almost every type of cooked food. They were granted many charters throughout their existence. In fact, when monarchs passed away and another monarch came, every guild was granted a new charter. But then sometimes within the life of a monarch, there could be changes. So there really can be quite a number of charters for guilds. For the Roti Sewers, though, the charter that I focused on for this paper was the Charter of 1509. And the reason I focused on that charter is because of something that happened just slightly before that, which was the foundation of the Charcutiers, who were founded in 1475. The Charcutiers could only operate in the suburbs of Paris, so they were not allowed within the city walls, and they were only allowed to sell cooked meat packaged for takeaway. So that includes sausages, fish, and many different types of pork. In this paper, I used the Charcutiers founding charter, the 1475 charter. And lastly, the third guild that I'll compare today were the Culinaires, or they were also called the Culinary Texts. They were granted their first charter in 1599. So that is why the date of my presentation runs from 1475 to 1599. These weren't significant dates outside of the fact that the charters were granted on those dates. And this 1599 Culinary Charter granted the right to members to cater feasts. So we have the Roti Sewers, who could sell almost anything. We have the Charcutiers, who had to be outside the city wall in the suburbs and were quite limited in what they could sell, focusing especially on pork. And then we have the Culinary Texts. These were the caterers, and this guild is special for another reason. Members of this guild had to work in the private, royal, and noble households resident within Paris. So, and in this case, I used their 1599 foundation charter. These charters are available to us in Nicolas de la Mare's amazing work. Nicolas de la Mare was the commissioner of the Paris police, and he lived between 1369 and 1723. He was, we could say, uniquely fascinated with the guilds and recorded a truly astounding amount of the ephemera surrounding these guilds, including royal and noble charters, also including narrative that has sometimes dubious and sometimes accurate evidence. But he truly loved the guilds and wanted us to know how they operated. And so he actually did write a 4-volume work. And the 4th volume was published after his death, sometime after his death. It was called the Traite de la Police. And in these 4 volumes, There are charters, rules, narratives, descriptions, other relevant texts that describe the functioning of almost every food-related guild, including the fishers, the bakers, the patissiers, the bakers of spiced bread, which was another guild, short-lived in the 16th century. Lemaire captured these and he really recorded the bylaws of these guilds. Some of these charters did survive outside of Nicolas de Lemaire's Traité de la Police, and they exist today mostly in the Archives Nationales and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And to get back to one question that I raised at the beginning, and I can answer it quite quickly now, is that the guild charters actually, at least the three that I've included here and the others that I've looked at, do not include any mention about cookbooks or recipes. These are direct and illustrative sources, and probably the most direct and illustrative surviving sources to describe the Parisian food guilds, but they were written in a very polished, a very formulaic version of early modern court French. And the charters from one guild to another are so formulaic that you can tell that the urge was to get the guild to conform to the way that the charter is usually produced, as opposed to establishing a unique group of people who have total freedom to ply their trade. So the charters are filtered through many lenses before being committed to vellum. And these are guilds at their best. So in the charters, we have the guilds acting perfectly, not violating any rules. They are an idealized notion of what was important about cooks, and it was created through a process of the cooks and the state coming together to establish what I'm calling today the recipe for a good cook, who would be a member of one of these three guilds. Therefore, there is a formula for creating a cook, and it exists in these charters. It doesn't capture every aspect of what would be important to be a cook, but from the official or legalistic perspective, we can isolate approximately 6 elements that were important to each of the guilds, or about which most of the guilds commented on. These 6 elements are being trained by a master, completing the masterpiece exam, teaching apprentices which ingredients could or could not be sold, maintaining a jury in a body of guild overseers, public acceptance of the member or the new master, and a sense of exclusivity. And I'll come back to this at the end. When it comes to being trained by a master, unless a guild was newly formed, all guilds required that apprentices were trained by a recognized master of the city of Paris. During the medieval period, some of the food guilds only allowed sons of masters, and this actually included the Roti Sewers in their 1258 charter. However, by the time of the 1509 charter, the Roti Sewers had relaxed these restrictions that only allowed sons to practice, and finally began allowing apprentices to challenge the journeyship ordeal once they had been apprenticed in the said mystery for 2 years. And that's from the 1509 charter. Slightly earlier, in the case of the Charcutiers, in their 1475 charter, they specified that members did not have to be the sons of masters, noting simply that all members had to apprentice for 4 years of service, but they did not have to be related to a master. For the cuisiniers, founded in 1599, and these are the noble and aristocratic cooks who are allowed to cater events, they were required to train for not more and not less than 3 years. Their training period could not exceed 3 years. They had to perform the mastership exam by the 3rd year, by the end of the 3rd year. And the 1599 charter noted that the apprentice must perform service to the masters of the said mystery for the time and space of 3 entire years, and after the 3rd year he is obliged to make the masterpiece of the said mystery. If the cuisinier is the son of a master, then he may apprentice only for 2 years. So although you could get into the guild by not being the son of a master, if you were the son of a master, cuisinier, then your training time was shorter. Therefore, some link to an accepted master of the city of Paris was the single most important ingredient that went into making a 16th century Parisian cook. Completion of the masterpiece gradually became another important ingredient for making a good cook. Originally, the Roti Sewers did not include a masterpiece exam. However, by 1509, the charter did include the requirement to create a masterpiece, although the exact format of this masterpiece was not described in the charters. However, this new clause was listed as the very first item in the 1509 charter. Additionally, the Roti Sewers required that anyone challenging the examination had to do so under the watch of the masters of the jury of the said mystery. So it was the jury themselves who would oversee this ordeal that was newly instituted for the Roti Sewers in 1509. It may have been added to their charter because of the foundation of the Charcutiers about 30 years before in 1475. From the time of the first charter of the Charcutiers, they did include a masterpiece exam. So although you didn't have to be a son, you could challenge the trade through performing the masterpiece, and that was always a piece of the Charcutiers. They, however, did not specify what this masterpiece ordeal would be. In order to understand something of the form of the masterpiece exam, we must look to the 1599 charter for the cuisiniers. In this charter, the text noted that no one may seek to be received into the said mystery of a master cook, chef, and cooks of the said city of Paris, unless he has made the masterpiece in the presence of 2 masters of the said mystery who have been elected to the jury. And also, that the masterpiece is required to be completed in order to be received into the mastership of the said mystery. As I said, this is quite formulaic language. Made out of diverse meats and fish according to the seasons of the year, and to be made in the house of one of the said jury members, and with the assistance of 12 masters of the said mystery. So in this case, this is the cuisinier traiteurs. They're the noble cooks full-time, but then they also have this guild that allows them to cater outside their houses. When that clause refers to being made in the house, I assume they're discussing their master's house, the house they're employed in. And the feast was substantial enough, and if we think of the aristocratic tradition and the large feasts that descend from that tradition, it was large enough to require 12 masters, not apprentices or journey persons. The charter does say masters, to assist in the preparation of this banquet. Therefore, we have 2 of the ingredients of being a good Parisian cook during the 16th century: training under a master and passing the masterpiece exam under the watchful eyes of the masters and the jury of the 3 guilds. However, beyond these 2 items, teaching apprentices which ingredients could or could not be sold was one of the most important things that every guild had to see to. It was one of the fundamental duties of, in fact, that the entire existence of the guild was based on. The Roti Sewers traditionally sold all types of cooked meats. However, with the foundation of the Charcutiers in 1475, the Roti Sewers did have to accept that a new guild could also sell cooked meat dishes, and especially pork, at least in the suburbs of Paris, wherein the Charcutiers were licensed to operate. Similarly, when the Charcutiers were founded, their 1475 charter said that masters may no longer sell fruits, cabbages, chard, greens, butters, cheeses, etc., excepting only sausages and cooked roasts of pork, wholesome and seemly. The most privileged of these guilds, in terms of the scope of what they could sell, were the cuisiniers. Beyond cooking for royal and aristocratic households, the cuisiniers held the right to cater feasts and special events, so they could sell any type of dish that they wanted when catering an event. They couldn't run a store. Only when they catered an event could they do this. As the first article of the 1599 charter noted, the guild was established so that the pâtissiers, Roti Sewers, Charcutiers, and all others of such mysteries do not seek to infringe on the said mystery through the making of dinners, feasts, or banquets, either in their houses or in other places, if it is not a right of the said mystery. Therefore, we have the third ingredient of what makes a good cook in Paris during this time, which is obeying the guild regulations when it comes to the type and the place where goods could be sold. Now, we may not think of this as being an ingredient in a recipe for making a good cook, but maintaining a jury or a small body of guild overseers was crucial to the sustainability of the guild. The jury worked to oversee new admissions to the guild, to judge cases where, for example, rotten food was served within the city market, and the police were called to investigate. Typically, they would call the jury members and have them assess whether the capon is rotten or such. The jury also worked to forbid non-members from selling goods, which makes the existence of the guild valuable for members. And many of the charters of each guild examined here include the mention of the jury and its composition and how members of the jury could be replaced. In the case of the 1475 Charcutiers charter, the process for selecting the jury was described in a great deal of detail, saying, and for the maintenance of the guild, there should be 2 jury members who are elected by the commonalty of gentlemen of the said mystery, and each year on the day of St. Remigius, they shall replace one of the 2, and in his place shall be elected another from the said gentleman, and having his election certified by the Châtelet before ourselves or our lieutenant, and he shall serve on the jury of the said mystery well and loyally, maintaining the statutes and ordinances, and rectifying any faults that are found in the chamber of the procurer of the king, and as well he shall make an account of the fines of the guild and other things, and this shall be received by the said master. Similarly, the cuisiniers in their 1599 charter called for this type of replacement. The cuisiniers actually had 4 jury members, and they would replace 2 semi-frequently so that the understanding of the affairs of the said mystery can be given to the 2 who are elected later. So when these guild juries were formed, there might be 2 or 4 people, but they really tried to avoid all of them stepping down from their position at once. They always tried to keep half the jury in its position to inform the new members of what was happening. In most of the guilds examined here, there was the requirement of the jurors to be selected from among the masters of the guild, which wouldn't be too surprising. But the only charter to go into further details about this was the 1599 Cuisiniers Charter, where they note that none of the said masters shall seek to obtain jurorship of the said mystery if they are not a master in the confraternity and proficient in the craft according to the opinion of the old masters of the said mystery. So they didn't want pencil pushers. They wanted real cooks leading the jury and leading the guild. The importance of this ingredient lays in the approach to standardize guild members' training, to standardize the rules of admittance to the guild, and to protect the overall reputation of the guild, again, to make the guild valuable to belong to. The jury was the official organism of state that carried both the knowledge of the craft necessary to evaluate craft work, as well as the power to carry out fines, prohibitions, and even to support the procurer of the Grand Châtelet when prosecuting trade-related cases. So without the jury, none of these rules would really have teeth. Public acceptance was another important feature of guild cooks in Paris during the 16th century. This might only be public for the Roti Sewers in the sense that the knowledge that the new master had obtained membership was really only shared among the jury and the guild members. The Charcutiers, on the other hand, their members were certified by the Châtelet before the jury and the lieutenant. In this case, it was a more public sense of accepting the new master guildsperson. And finally, for the cuisiniers, they had a public element of their acceptance in the sense that the feast had to be prepared with 12 masters who watched the feast from beginning to end and worked with the cook and were under the direction of the cook for that time, in addition to the possibly 4 jury members that were also present in the kitchen that day, assessing the masterpiece. So this type of witness allowed it for the new master to be accepted by current masters and by extension by the citizens of Paris as one of their new master craftspersons. The final ingredient is this notion of exclusivity, which made a good, at least guildsperson cook during the 16th century. We met this concept earlier when looking at the types of ingredients or dishes different guilds could sell. But numerous times the charters here, almost all of them, refer to foreign members or foreign persons partaking in the craft. When it comes to these guilds, foreign meant any master who was not a resident in the city or suburbs of Paris, or simply someone who may have been a resident of the city but had no authority to practice the craft, any non-master of the city. Therefore, the charters often read that no foreigner may take an apprentice of the said mystery, which means that no one other than a master resident in Paris may take an apprentice. And finally, there were further exclusions, but an interesting one was the Cuisiniers 1599 charter. These are the noble royal cooks, specifically prohibited the cooks of the bourgeois from rising above the station of a journey person. They do say that the gentlemen of the kitchen who work for the bourgeois in their households may only receive their journeyship and not seek other stations within the said mystery of cook, that is, making feasts and dinners, on pain of fine which shall be judged in the customary manner. The cuisiniers were so closely associated with the aristocracy that they didn't want to allow the cooks of the bourgeois to cater feasts. There might have been too many cooks, so decreasing the value of the guild in the first place. Or it might have been a snub against the type of household that they worked in. But this idea that there are limits, finite limits, and that your duty as a guildsperson is to inform yourself of those limits and obey them and uphold them, that was an important piece, not just of the dishes that people sold, but the manner in which they conducted their business. So to conclude, the charters are rich sources of information regarding the cooks working in Paris during the 16th century. But they portray an official or ideal version of the Roti Sewers, the Charcutiers, and the cuisiniers, and they give us some idea of the frontiers or limits of the trade when it came to commerce, to training, to punishment, inspection rights, methods of sale, or even actual dishes for sale. The 6 aspects of cooks that I focused on here were not the only important items that apprentices had to attend to, but they are aspects that were able to peek through the legislative and legalistic text of the charters, and that can help us understand how consistency might be achieved when training early modern Parisian cooks. By spending years to train under a current master, the Guild ensured continuity of recipe tradition. By witnessing the completion of the masterpiece, and further by making this public knowledge among the masters, guilds ensured that the skill level of entrance was at a common level that was viewable and proved, if you will. By steeping apprentices with a wide-ranging sense of exclusivity, these ingredients are banned to sale, these people are banned from selling, your shop cannot be outside this area. Apprentices understood that they needed to navigate a culture of finite public food laws while also absorbing Parisian public food culture and meeting customer expectations. And finally, by maintaining the jury and ensuring that there was a mechanism for its perpetual maintenance, the jury ensured that its bylaws could be enforced and that the trade had an advocate among the many other guilds present at the Grand Châtelet. And I want to say one final thing about the food itself. We come so close in the charters to being able to see the inside of the cook shop and see the food laying out behind the counter. We have a sense that at some point the guild jury members were knocking on the door of a poor charcutier who dared to sell sausages with some vegetables and filed a petition, many of which survive today. As close as we come to seeing these types of instances, we don't get a good sense of what was actually for sale. The charters were not the place for that. They were formulaic manuscripts concerned with setting a general standard that was applicable to all practicing masters. The charters were also concerned with making clear that these powers were granted to the guild by royal prerogative. They weren't the place where we will find descriptions of cabbage dishes and fritters for sale. It was the closeness to a master that accomplished understanding these recipes for apprentices. But I also wonder, were surviving cookbooks the place that housed this knowledge? Was the food we see in cookbooks similar to the food that these guild person cooks were making in the public sphere? Was there a difference between early modern Parisian public sphere food and private sphere dishes? I do wonder if this might have been the case myself. Was there more deep fried food available in the marketplace, for example? Was food dressed and garnished in ways that chefs are still famous for today? And if so, how might that have differed from the private sphere? Whatever the case may be, from the charters and the official perspective, we can be sure that the recipe for an ideal guildsperson included many more rules and mores than captured in the charters themselves. These bylaws captured the frontiers of what was and was not acceptable for the guild, always with a focus on creating craftspeople who were, as one charter was proud to say, expert gentlemen and non-suspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left for questions. I already have one question for you from Beatrice Legnon. Good evening. Do we find any notes concerning the place of women, as was the case with upholsterers, or in particular in the event of an inheritance on the death of the husband?
That's an excellent question. And yes, we do. In certain guilds, find daughters and wives taking part officially in the guild. The Roti Sewers did not allow any daughters or wives to officially own or command any part of the business, although they could work inside the shop. I didn't look at this guild here, but the pâtissiers were actually the group that were in charge of producing the Eucharistic bread used in Paris churches. And the clauses dealing with the preparation of that bread do note that any wives who may be present or daughters in the bakery at the time that the hosts are being prepared must leave the bakery and have essentially nothing to do with the creation of this bread, which I was more interested to find that suggests that they were regularly around the bake shop. And the Charcutiers not only allowed daughters and wives to practice in the shop, they still had to have journey persons and masters to conduct the apprenticeship. But if a master charcutier died, these are the pork sellers and the takeaway sellers, the wife actually was allowed to inherit the shop and run the shop and hire a journey person, and hire a master who could continue the apprenticeships and training. They were the only guild that allowed for this of the three that I looked at. And the cuisiniers don't ever mention females once. So I think the great household tradition of cookery, it does seem to have been dominated, at least in this context, by men. Even though some of the paintings that in a similar style to what Merit showed, some of the Dutch still life paintings and kitchen scenes actually do show aristocratic kitchens that are staffed by a mixture of male and females.
Thank you. This is actually the only question we have at the moment, which is good. So I think we can come to the conclusion, and I'm sure if anyone has any more questions, you both would be fine with them getting back to you.
Definitely.
Yes, so this was our session, which focused on the intersection between textual recipe traditions and the evidence left behind from, let's say, the real life, either from an archaeobotanical perspective, what people actually ate and disposed of, or the guilds with their charters informing us what was to be done and not to be done, perhaps mostly not to be done. Which sheds an interesting light on the, let's say, daily food practices outside of the cookbooks. And there are some, well, very interesting sort of overlap between what Ryan has told you and what I find as an archaeobotanist, which might differ a bit from what we read from cookbooks, which shows us that there is really so much to learn about food that was not written down, which was not necessarily, well, only available for the upper classes, who at first, of course, were the persons to own cookbooks or have them written. So it's very fascinating to see how this relates to each other. And I would like to draw your attention to the demonstration that we organize come Friday evening, in which we will recreate an historical recipe, or two recipes actually, to see, well, what happens if you cook a recipe, well, recreate a recipe when you cook without any knowledge of what you are supposed to do, which was my case. And Ryan, who is a bit more of an expert chef, probably knew exactly what he was doing, or at least what the outcome, okay, should have been. And we would like to continue, well, on Friday evening with our demonstration to discuss the, let's say, hidden information in recipes, either medieval or early modern, to see what's more. Yeah. So Ryan, I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
No, that's excellent, Merit. It is very fascinating to take a step out of the cookbooks and into the streets and start to see the food in the city and around us. So I'm very much looking forward to joining everyone on Friday, and we'll see what our sauces look like. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and would love to hear any feedback that you might have, especially concerning the sauces. But if you have any questions, speaking for myself, but perhaps also for Ryan, do feel free to contact us and ask your questions outside of this conference, because This session has surpassed its limit of 1.5 hours, so I assume that this is it, but thank you very much for attending.